I've got an assortment of Imba styling features that don't really fit anywhere else, but are too cool for me not to mention. And we'll just go through these quickly so you're aware of them. In each one, I define a custom tag, and then I mount it. So it's an isolated little example. All right, the first one is conditional styles. So you can see I've mounted two of these conditional styles tags. One has a prop lights on set to false, one has a prop lights on set to true. And in order to change the color here from gray to red, I've set an inline style of BGC red 4, and then I said equals lights on. So this lights on prop, it's actually like you assign it to the inline style, and that's going to conditionally apply this style. If lights on is false, this style won't be applied. And you can have multiple inline styles. So you could have other styles here that are always applied, and then one here that's conditionally applied. You can even have another one that's conditionally applied with a different condition other than this. The next example is conditional classes. This is really similar to the last one, and I use this all the time. So in this one, instead of turning a inline style on and off, I'm setting a class equal to that same lights on prop, and then I've added a style rule that styles that class. And so you can have classes that are always there, or I could have another one that has a different value that's turning it on and off. So when you assign a class to a Boolean, that's going to determine whether that class is applied or not. And it's so common that you have little classes that act as flags that you either want to apply or not. Imba gives you this really great shortcut for doing that. The next example is class modifiers. So this is basically the same example as the last one, except instead of adding a CSS rule for .light, I was able to put it in line here by saying BGC gray 4 .light amber 5. Now, if you remember from CSS modifiers, the syntax is something like this, where you can immediately follow a value with a modifier. You can use classes as modifiers in this trailing modifier syntax in order to quickly set a property only for a given class name. Sorry, that should be back to light. So light is being applied conditionally based on this value, and if light is applied, BGC is going to be amber 5. The next example is interpolated classes. So let's look down here in imba.mount. I'm mounting several of these interpolated classes tags, and each one has a light type prop. And you can see up here that's defined. And so for one, it's off, another is go, slow, stop. So I'm passing in different strings. And what I want to do is, to the self tag, I want to apply a class with the name of the string that's been passed in. You can interpolate any string as a class name using these curly braces. So instead of .some class, you can instead write curly braces and then put a variable name there, and the contents of that variable will be the class name. And so the class name is going to be one of these strings that's getting passed in, and I've added styling rules for all of those with different colors. And then I also made the contents of this tag be the name of the class name just so we can see it. So this one has .off, this one has .go, .slow, .stop. So not only can you interpolate class names, you can also interpolate style values. So this tag has style that sets the self tag to be 20 pixels by 20 pixels. And then there's an inline style here on the self tag, which is BGC. So the background color is using an HSL color. If you haven't seen that, that's hue, saturation, and lightness. And the first value is an angle, which defines the hue, and then saturation and lightness. So you can define the angle with different values, degrees, radians, or turns, where one turn is 360 degrees. So if I put 0.5, we get a different color. I'll put 0.2, we get a different color. And what I want to do is actually use this prop, this hue prop, as the color here. So we can actually interpolate that in using curly braces right here before the units. The units are turn here. And so I'm going to put hue. And check out what I've done here. I did a loop for num in 0 to 10. And then I'm going to have 10 of these interpolated style tags where the hue is num times 0.1. All right, let's see how that looks. And we get this cool rainbow. But the point is, whether it's a string or a number, you can interpolate a variable into your CSS values. It's very useful. And there's some really cool examples that I could show you, but they kind of rely on some things we haven't learned about yet. But I'm going to show you anyways because it's just too cool. I'm just going to paste in an alternate version of this tag that uses a couple of things you haven't learned about, like this touch thing here, which is an event. And there's a new property here called val. And notice that I have a rotate property with val degrees. And I have an inline style here that's set to val does not equal 0. So this expression is going to return a Boolean, and that's going to conditionally apply this style. So there's some magic happening here with this touch.sync thing, but don't worry about that. We'll learn about it later. But check out what I can do now. I can click and drag on these, and they expand, and my dragging rotates them. It sets the rotate value. So obviously there's some magic with this touch.sync that's setting the val property, but the way I'm able to use it directly in my styles is I just interpolate it in here, so the rotate is val degrees. Really fun, and it's a very small amount of code in order to create something this interactive. It's great. Now, one thing you need to know if you want to interpolate style values is that you can only do this interpolating of style values within self. So it's not going to work on a CSS declaration that's applied up here, but it works on all the inline styles. And it will work if you define your CSS within your HTML, which I'm going to show you in the next example. So this next example is CSS in tags. And you can see I've got the self tag here, and then I have a CSS block indented inside of that. Now this will allow us to interpolate styles inside of it because it's inside of the self tag. And it's basically the same result as our first example from the last one. And one thing to note about this, whenever you put a CSS block inside of a tag like this, indented in, the styles here are scoped to that tag. So without a selector, it's going to apply to that tag, which means if I were to put a div tag here and indent this inside of that, these styles now actually apply to this div. All right, and the last example I have is Imba's shorthand for variables. So variables, sometimes called custom properties in CSS. The official syntax for this, it actually works in Imba. I have a little example of that here. Let me uncomment it. So you can define a variable with this double dash thing, and you can set the value to a color. Of course, I'm using Imba's colors here, but you can set any kind of value. And this is built in part of CSS. But then to use it, you say color, var, and it's like a function with this double dash. The syntax here is kind of a mess. It's not the most beautiful syntax. So that works in Imba, and that's the official CSS syntax. But Imba provides an alternate syntax that's a lot more convenient. You just use a $sign. So $sign primary color row 7. I've defined a variable called primary color with the value as row 7. And then you can see down here I use it, color, primary color. You don't have to use the var function. You just do $sign primary color. And so I have an A tag selector and a button selector. And in both of them, I'm using primary color, secondary color, and I'm using them in different places just to show the value of using CSS variables. And you can see the button and the link here both make use of those colors. And if I were to come up here and change this to like blue 8, then it applies in both places because it's a variable. Cool, so hopefully you found those examples useful. This sort of concludes our lessons on CSS for now. Definitely check out imba.io if you want to read through all the details of all these different CSS techniques. And I went through these ones pretty quick because I just wanted you to be aware that all this cool stuff exists so that when you run into a situation where it might be useful, you remember it exists, you can go look up how to do it, or come back to this video as a reference.